The Washington Post reported not long ago, earlier this year, that President Trump at one point phoned Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, to ask him how Putin wanted him, the American president, to start behaving toward North Korea. North Korea, of course, has a border with Russia. Russia has helped North Korea evade sanctions that we put on North Korea as they have tried to shore up the North Korean dictatorship. Why would an American president ask Vladimir Putin for direction in terms of how Putin wants the United States to start treating North Korea? Why would you ask that? We still don't know. We can only guess. But the record of that call in which President Trump is reported to have asked Vladimir Putin what he wants the U.S. to now do toward North Korea. I mean, maybe Putin had the idea for moving Seoul. We don't know. I mean, the record of that call is reportedly one of the Trump presidential call records that has been taken out of circulation effectively inside the White House and inside the national security apparatus of the United States of America. They locked up the record of that call on a code word level, super highly secure server, so almost nobody can access that record. The Trump White House is reported to have done that with call records between President Trump and Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. The Trump White House is reported to have done that to call records from multiple calls between President Trump and President Putin, including the one where he reportedly asked Putin what he wanted the U.S. policy to henceforth be toward North Korea, the one in which he asked Putin to set U.S. policy toward North Korea. The Trump White House has also reportedly locked up the presidential call records in which President Trump is recorded as having spent a solid 10 minutes on a phone call with then British Prime Minister Theresa May, trying to talk her out of the idea that the Russian government was to blame for that assassination effort in Britain, where an ex-Russian spy was targeted with a Russian military-grade nerve agent. Trump apparently spent 10 minutes on the phone trying to convince Theresa May that Russia didn't do it, that it must have been somebody else. The Trump White House also reportedly locked up the records of the meeting that President Trump took with the Russian foreign minister in the Oval Office in 2017. Immediately after that meeting with the Russian foreign minister in May 2017, a number of disturbing elements of that meeting leaked out, right? That's where we got word that President Trump had shared super top secret information that he wasn't supposed to give them and that our allies didn't know he was sharing with anybody, let alone the Russians. We also found out shortly after that meeting that he told the Russians that he had just fired the FBI director the day before, and he believed that would relieve the pressure on him over Russia. We would only find out months and months later, this year actually, that at that meeting, the president did something even more direct with those Russian government officials. We learned that Trump White House officials also locked up a record from that meeting, a memorandum of what happened during that meeting in the Oval Office. And that memorandum indicated that one of the things the president told the Russian foreign minister that day in the Oval Office was that he was okay with Russia having intervened in the 2016 election to help put him in the White House. President Trump told two senior Russian officials in a 2017 Oval Office meeting that he was, quote, unconcerned about Moscow's interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. He was okay with it. He didn't mind that. The official White House record of that meeting, which showed the president making those comments, is another one of those records of the president's calls and meetings and behavior that has reportedly been locked up in some sort of secure server or otherwise isolated in some way to restrict access to it. So in the normal course of events, White House officials and American national security officials can't see that record. They can't access the record of what President Trump actually did and said. And of course, we also learned first from the whistleblower, from the intelligence community whistleblower who filed this report with the Intelligence Committee, that one of the other things that Trump White House officials locked up and put in a super secure server to keep people from accessing that information was the initial record of President Trump calling Ukraine in July this year, the call in which he told the Ukrainian president that the Ukrainian government needed to announce an investigation into Joe Biden. That call record, too, was, at least initially, locked up by Trump White House officials to try to prevent anybody from knowing what President Trump had actually said on that call.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.